today. My name is Baylee Fox. I'm the Business Development Manager at the Greenville ENC Alliance, and I will be moderating today's webinar. If you're not familiar with our organization, let me provide you with a little bit of a background. We're a public-private partnership focused on economic development in Greenville-Pitt County through industry recruitment, expansions and retentions, development of sites and buildings, marketing and promotion of the community, workforce development, talent attraction, and talent retention, and small business and entrepreneurship efforts, which is why we're here today. We're excited to host this webinar series on a monthly basis with speakers on various topics to help small business owners and entrepreneurs start, maintain, and grow their businesses here in Greenville-Pitt County. Today, we're honored to have Jane Francis Nowell, business attorney at Ward & Smith, PA, join us to discuss essential legal aspects for small business owners, including business structures, succession planning, and more. Just a few housekeeping notes as we dive into today's programming. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat. There will be time for a Q&A at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we will address them at the end. Please stay on mute during the presentation, and this webinar will be recorded, so if you join late or have to leave early, we will send you the link to review the session within the next 24 hours. Now, without any further discussion, let's introduce Jane Francis. Jane Francis Nowell is a business attorney with Ward & Smith, PA, primarily focused on business and corporate law, including mergers and acquisitions, contract negotiation, and drafting, as well as general business counseling. She completed her JD at Campbell Law and was the managing editor of Campbell Law Review while there. She additionally obtained her BS from Roanoke College. Jane Francis, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much. I love being introduced by somebody else. I always feel so much more important than I do every day, so that's so exciting. I'm really looking forward to being here. I'm very passionate about small business and really care a lot about giving back. My background is my family owns a small business, and that's really what got me here is, what did my dad not have? Like, what tools did he not have that would have helped him further forward his career and his business in a way that wasn't attainable for him? So I like to try to make that more accessible to the community. So I'm glad to be here and hopefully help you guys today. I'm going to be talking about the most common legal mistakes of small businesses, right? So this is a variety of different mistakes that we see a lot and we do a lot of work to fix. So I thought that it would be helpful to kind of start out with what to do right so that you don't need me to play cleanup, right? This is a good opportunity to get started on the right foot and really set yourself up for success. As a small business owner, you're very passionate about what you do and the services you're providing. So let me help you do that to the best of your ability by maybe thinking about some less exciting parts of your business that will really, make you a better business owner. So first, the very basics of, being a small business is choosing the wrong business entity, right? You want to make sure that you are thinking about what you want your business to be, how you want to set it up for the long term. And I'm sure, a lot of times when you were first starting out, you have, say, we'll use our example of the previous slide, which is like a bakery. So you're good at making bread, you want to start selling it, you open a storefront, and you're just kind of moving one step to the next and maybe not thinking so much about the larger legal picture that you have now found yourself in. So remembering to take a step back and thinking, okay, how do I want to grow this? How do I best protect my liability at this stage? And working to really optimize your business. You want to look at all of the different entities that are offered, right? There's a lot of different ones. On the next slide, we're going to look at a chart that kind of shows all of the different standard legal entities. But you want to, let's acknowledge there's not a universally correct choice, right? If there was, we would just have one entity type. If everybody should be an LLC, then that's maybe all we should have. But there are tons of different structures that all benefit different business types, right? You want to make sure that you are working with somebody who can help advise you both from a legal and tax perspective on what kind of entity to choose. Because, as I mentioned, there are many types, right? So Here alone, there are just 5 different types of entities laid out. I thought this would be a helpful chart for you to kind of self-evaluate what might be best for you. Because, the different entity types are going to change based on how many owners you have. It's going to change based on the amount of corporate formality you want to follow. If you're interested in maybe having an equity owner down the road, you might want to choose a different entity. So just from a very basic summary, you have the sole proprietorship, which in our hypothetical of the bakery, when you start out before you've incorporated, you are a sole proprietor, right? If you were one owner who's operating a business, selling goods or providing services, what have you, you're operating as a sole proprietor. There are no operational documents. There's no formal document needed with the Secretary of State to form this kind of per se entity, right? Which means, you are that structure simply because you're operating inside of it. You haven't done any affirmative action. We don't recommend, lasting as a sole proprietor very long because you want to have those corporate formalities in place to make sure that you're having limited liability. So a general partnership is essentially the same as a sole proprietor, but it's with more than one partner. So if you, again, start a bakery with one of your close friends, you're going to automatically be that general partnership. And also in here, it references assumed business names. I don't know if you guys probably don't keep up with the changes to the assumed business name and DBA world, but recently, as of 2 years ago, I believe, we moved from a county specific filing to a statewide filing. So that would be a good tip. If you filed a long time ago a DBA in your county, you might want to go ahead and refile in the Secretary of State's office to make sure that your DBA is still good and effective across the state. So this is a great thing for small businesses that we've changed. You don't have to file a DBA in each county you're operating in. Now it's statewide. So it's a very good thing that the Secretary of State has put in place and something to do regardless of your entity type, especially if you're not using the same name as your legal entity. I'm going to skip over limited partnerships. If you are in a situation where you need a limited partnership, you're in a little bit more of a complicated space and probably want to engage an attorney. But corporations and limited liability companies are really our most 2 common entities. Corporations have been around for a very long time and are filed by filing articles of incorporation. They have however many owners you want, right? And they come with a lot of corporate formalities where you have to meet annually. You have to keep up with your bylaws. Every time you meet, you want to file some minutes to keep up with what was discussed in every annual meeting. And there's a little bit less flexibility in the corporate structure, but they do provide limited liability, which is obviously one of the key reasons you want to form an entity, which is because the corporation is a separate legal entity, so it holds its own liability. And as long as you're following the corporate rules, that's going to be where your liability lives instead of in the individual owners. Limited liability companies are a newer beast in the legal world, not new in the grand scheme of things. They've been around for, I think, since the 90s. It's when they in North Carolina adopted them, but don't hold me to that. But they are a newer form of entity, and they're a lot more flexible, right? So they can be taxed as a corporation. They can be taxed as a partnership, which your CPA will love if you walk in with already equipped with that kind of language and are able to kind of talk about what you want. And they can have one member, they can have many members. They are also formed by filing articles, and they are governed by an operating agreement. So both a corporation and a limited liability company have these governing documents that are very important when you're forming an entity, especially if you're with partners, because you really want to get that conversation flowing and talk about exactly what you both want, how you want to govern the entity that you've chosen. What happens if there's a conflict? What happens if you want to take out a significant loan? What kind of agreement do we need? So it's important to have those kind of conversations, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go along. But just remember, there's a lot of different choices and there's no one size fits all, but thinking through, looking on the Secretary of State's website, talking to an attorney if you're at that point to really figure out your best option is definitely recommended. So you have hopefully now created an entity, right? What is the second mistake that small business owners often make? You form this entity, you spent the money filing the Secretary of State, and yet you're still exposing yourself to personal liability. We don't want this. You want to really utilize the entity for the purpose that you've created it, because that's really why we go through this exercise. So some common pitfalls that we see is not separating personal finances, not following securities laws, and then remembering that, just having insurance alone isn't going to help you stay completely liability free, right? We want to make sure we're kind of piling on the protections, right? You want to have the entity in place. You want to follow the corporate formalities, which means whether that's, filing every year your annual report, or making sure to hold your annual meeting, or making sure to keep your finances separate, right? So having a separate bank account for the business and a separate account for you personally, and not commingling those funds, and making sure you're really following the letter of the law is important. It's not very exciting, but it's good to have, to keep in good practice and keep good practices established from the beginning, because you don't want to end up in a place where you're, kind of loosely treating the corporation as separately. And then there could be liability down the way, like a piercing of the corporate veil, where essentially under the law, despite your entity formation, you're perceived as being just the same as your entity, and liability is really easily transferred there. So to summarize here, you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your entity, which is very important. Okay, the third mistake, which I kind of referenced earlier, is starting your company without a base partnership agreement. Whenever I am working with a client and talking about, the first piece of this, right? Thinking about what you want for your business and how you want to run it, it really does feel in a way like a marriage, right? You're in a very personal financial relationship with your co-founder, and you want to make sure that you're thinking through these decisions, because if down the line, there is a disagreement that leads to one or both of you wanting to exit the business, that can be very expensive, right? And it can be very toxic. You likely are friends, or at least have a good working relationship, that sours and takes you to a place where you no longer want to be inside that relationship. It's going to be tricky to figure out how to divide up that business, who walks away with the majority share, or just what kind of next steps happen. We always say the goal of any agreement between founders, is to define expectations between the company and each founder, the founders to one another, and if you're purchasing the company, between the founders and the later owners, right? So there's a lot, even if you're a sole proprietor at the time you're forming your entity, you want to think, am I going to bring on partners down the road? And if so, it's probably to your advantage to go ahead and have a foundational agreement like this, so that you're not negotiating with them. You probably still will have to, have discussions, but going ahead and having that established is going to be a really good thing, and make you more, attractive of a investment to those people as well, because you've already kind of got your ducks in a row and have shown that you're dedicated to the business, both in the actual performance and in the structuring. So key items that you want to see in the shareholders or operating agreements, depending on what kind of entity you have. Is equity ownership. Talk about the decision-making structure, talk about how you can add new shareholders. And another one I've seen lately is making sure you have provisions in there for like exempt transfers. So later down the road, if you want to transfer to a trust for, in your estate planning space, you want to hold that maybe not individually anymore, but hold it in a trust for your children and grandchildren, or even just a revocable trust. You are going to want to build that in, right? There's a way to have a provision that allows that to occur without, going through the more structured shareholder addition process, which is often very helpful, especially a lot of small businesses end up being maybe the larger chunk of a lot of the founders' estate planning, estate planning goals, right? So if you have that provision, it's very helpful. And another thing to consider is including protection for the company and for other shareholders, especially when a founder or a later member ceases employment or consulting. So say you bring in maybe one of your employees as an owner because they're a trusted employee, they've been around for 10 years, and you want to really motivate them to stay involved with the business. But if something happens, they're no longer employed, what happens then? Can they stay an owner? How do you help them exit smoothly out of the company? Are you paying them their full value, or are you agreeing to a lowered valuation due to that employment ceasing, right? What happens upon death if you're a married individual and you pass away? Is your significant other expecting to receive your ownership? Do you want your ownership to be automatically sold and then all of the proceeds go to them? You want to kind of think through these issues at the beginning. It's very similar to when you go into a marriage. You want to think about, okay, how do we want to run this? What happens if it ends? And really try to flesh that out at the beginning when you're getting along, because it's not going to get easier to unwind at the end, right? Divorce is also another good thing to discuss. There's we see a lot in small and closely held businesses where children are involved, that their children, maybe you're happy with their spouse, but then one of the spouses is divorced, and in the divorce proceedings, the judge grants ownership to one of the children's divorced ex-partners, which can be very messy, and you don't want that. You want to make sure that you're contemplating what happens in the case of a divorce. And simply wanting to leave the business, like I talked about earlier, it's better to go ahead and set these procedures in place so that down the road you just follow what you've already decided upon, and you're not instead trying to navigate these waters when maybe the relationship is rockier. So we're always very pro-based partnership agreement. And this can be, we obviously advocate for a more robust professional version of this, but if you don't have the funds in your business to do that at this point, I suggest sitting down and just writing out a bullet point list and really trying to hash it out by hand. So later, maybe when your company does have the funds, you can take that and memorialize it into a more formal agreement. But at least the discussion will hopefully help you kind of go over that hump and get to a better place. Okay, this is similar to what I just discussed, right? If you don't have this governing agreement in place, a big issue is a failure to plan for the future, right? Maybe your death isn't, unexpected, but not to be depressing, but that's coming for everybody at the end of their life. So what happens when that day does come, right? You want to think about your ownership and where it's going to pass. You want to think about valuation issues. If you've set it up in the governing documents so that your interest is to be purchased by the company and the proceeds to be given to your spouse, is that going to be based on a preset value? Is that going to be based on a valuation to occur after your death? Is that to be funded by insurance? You want to be thinking through these issues and figure out exactly how you want that transition to go, because it is unfortunately inevitable. Speaking of divorce, instead of thinking about it for the children, you want to think about it for yourself, right? You hopefully have a very good relationship going into your business, but it may not always be that way. You want to think about how your spouse interacts with the business. If they are an employee, what is that? How could that impact their ownership? How could that impact possible divorce proceedings? And in the case of a divorce between you and your spouse, what records are going to be required? Really everything, right? So if the court gets involved in your business, you want to be aware that they're going to be able to access a lot more documents than you would maybe be comfortable with. And so making sure to plan for these things and include provisions in your operating agreement is very important, because we don't want to see this happen to anybody. Another mistake is cutting corners on the wrong things, right? So at the beginning of your business, or even, at the mid-level, you're trying to make sure that your business is running smoothly, that you are maximizing profits. But there are a couple of things that you really want to make sure you're keeping in mind, right? So we always recommend a good accountant. They're worth the money. They get to know your business at the front, where it's pretty simple, and they're going to be able to help you make and save money down the road, right? When you're looking for a good accountant, make sure you check their references. You can always ask professionals for references. You can ask questions about their experience, whether that's with companies of your size, whether that's with companies in your specific industry. And then you also want to get an understanding of the cost structure, right? Are they billing you by the hour? Are they billing you just once a year for all the services rendered? Are you being billed monthly at a flat rate? All these different professionals bill different ways, right? There's not one way that's right. There's not one way that's wrong. But before you enter into that engagement, you want to make sure that your eyes are wide open. This applies also to attorneys. Like if you need to and decide to get an attorney to help you with your formation, asking the right questions at the beginning really helps set up transparency and trust. So it's a good thing to do. Another thing that maybe isn't front of mind is having good insurance, knowing what's covered, and specifically knowing what's not covered, right? So having a good relationship with your broker, with your provider, and really getting, kind of a good foundational understanding is going to be very helpful at the beginning, because you want to make sure you're protected from an insurance perspective. And you also want to keep your insurance carrier updated of changes. So if you are starting out as maybe, if we're going back to the bread example, so maybe you're starting out just providing bread and selling bread at farmers markets, and you go ahead and get insurance to cover your activities there. What happens when you get a storefront? You want to make sure you're updating that provider so you can up your insurance. What happens if you, decide to add additional employees? If you decide to start giving tours of like the bakery area, you want to think about these changes to your business that you may not think are of interest to the insurance carrier, but you may uncover different areas that you can be protected for a very, it's a very small thing to do, but can really have good results. We also, as I said earlier, when you're trying to figure out how to become profitable, making sure you're looking at your expenses often and, making sure you're assessing the value of what you're paying for, and doing that with regularity is very helpful. Just like your personal finances, you want to make sure you're apprised of where your money's going, because you'll be able to help control the spend better. Okay, number 6. This is a big one, especially for small to medium-sized businesses, and that is signing contracts without reviewing them. When you are handed what you assume is a boilerplate agreement for so say for servicing your trash disposal, right? You have an agreement with the company that comes and takes out your trash every week. You're often handed it. It may have blanks. It may have very small wording, and you may think, I don't have the time to look through this and identify issues, but they're just going to make me sign it. Remember, you are agreeing to the terms of that agreement. You have every right to look through those terms and ask questions. Maybe you're not going to get them to move a bunch, but at least you can walk into that agreement with a knowledge of what you have signed up for, right? So when you get handed any sort of agreement, whether it's online, you have like a PO, and at the bottom it says terms and conditions are online. Go pop over there and just check them out so you can see exactly what you're getting into, and making sure that you're going through and taking the time just to understand what is in them. So when you are handed an agreement of any kind, even if it doesn't say contract at the top, but there are terms, it's important to do these things. First, you want to verify that you see your correct entity name. I see a lot of contracts that are signed that will just say maybe like a location name, or it will say the individual's name. No, you definitely don't want to sign any contracts for your company that say your name. So you want to make sure, like, your individual name, not your company name. You want to make sure that you're signing with the right entity there. You want to make sure that the language is fairly clear. I know I'm biased as an attorney, that I think contracts can be clear. I know for the average person, it's not the favorite thing to read in a day, but you want to make sure that there aren't any provisions that you can't grasp at all, right? If there's services language that's describing services you don't understand, that's a good opportunity to ask questions of the individual who presented you with this contract, so you can figure out exactly what it is you're agreeing to. You want to make sure you take a look at the term. So a lot of agreements, especially more boilerplate agreements that are standardized, are going to say, for a term of 2 years and then renewing automatically until they're terminated. Then you're stuck, right? So you're stuck in that agreement until one of the breaches occurs, or if they terminate, or some other stickier issue. So I think if you can, pushing back to having shorter terms so that you can renegotiate those, maybe as your negotiating power increases, is maybe a good call at this stage of your business life. And then you also want to look at and see who's able to terminate and when. A lot of times there are going to be agreements that have one-way terminations, right? Say you're stuck and you can only terminate if they default, but then the provider of the services can terminate at any time with notice. Ask them, say, why is the termination for notice only one way, right? Say, can I have it? Can it be for both of us, right? If you're allowed to terminate for 30 days notice, I want to be able to terminate for 30 days notice. And that's a good question to ask, A, because it might work. And B, you want to hear that answer, right? Like, what do they say back to you in response to that? It's going to kind of give you a flavor for maybe what your relationship with that provider is going to look like. The next thing that is another very common mistake. Do you see blank spaces in the contract? If so, fill them in. A lot of times there will be a notice provision that asks for your address and your entity name. Go ahead and fill that in before you sign the agreement, so that you're establishing where notice needs to occur. And if there are other blanks throughout the document, there'll sometimes be like brackets with dates. Oh, that's a big one. The date of the agreement should always be filled in, right? A lot of times I see documents that are signed and there's no date on them. So if you have a 2-year term, but there's nobody bothered to sign it or to assign a date at the top, it's a problem. You should go ahead and try to fill in those dates when you're signing. So just making sure that you're filling in the blank spaces so that this agreement is as full as possible, I think it's a very good thing. So those are the basics, right? That's what you want to look at when you're signing an agreement that I think is pretty accessible to every person who is listening today. You're able to look for those small things. Now some more complicated provisions that you're gonna wanna keep an eye out for that can often add or shift liability to you as the business owner. Looking at that default provision, right? So what is a default under this agreement? One trend we're seeing in a lot of agreements is kind of boilerplate language relating to like supplier code of conducts. So we're seeing additional language that says, you know, as our customer, you're agreeing to comply with these code of conducts. And in those code of conducts, which often aren't actually in the agreement, they're a link. There will be language in there that gives rise to the other party to terminate if you violate one of these like 20-page long provisions. So that's something to keep an eye out for, this code of conduct, especially if you're operating as like a supplier or a service provider for whatever entity is handing you a boilerplate agreement. But you want to know what's going to cause this contract to be breached. Related to that, if you do breach, how long do you have to fix that breach? That's going to be in that same provision. It's going to say, you know, you have 5 days to cure, you have 10 days to cure. And this is a good opportunity to see whether something's one-sided as well, right? So are you both given the same opportunity to cure? Are they given a longer time to cure? Are you not given a right at all to cure? You want to think about the structure of that provision. Another basic, you want to make sure that you're looking at those important dates and deliverables, right? So depending on the type of contract you're looking at, you want to know, you know, the timelines that are expected, because that's going to be an often cause of a breach if a deadline is not met, right? So making sure you agree with those terms and taking a look at where they fall in the contract. Governing law. This is another one that's easy to spot, but can really change your rights. If you are a North Carolina company, you probably want to ask for them to let you have the contract be governed by North Carolina, right? There's no reason you should go to Montana or Colorado to govern a contract that's being performed in North Carolina, and it's always worth the ask, right? A lot of times, especially if you're in a more local North Carolina court, that's going to be advantageous to you as a North Carolina business owner to have your issues heard in front of, you know, jury of your own peers, right? Or in this case, a judge of your own peers, as it were. The most kind of legalese language that you're going to want to look out for is indemnification and limitation of liability. That provision is probably going to be a little confusing and not fun to trudge through, but it's an important thing to read, right? In the same way, is one party only indemnifying the other? Is it reciprocal? Are you getting the same protections that you're giving them under the agreement? Take a look at that limitation of liability language, see what you're waiving, right? That's going to be an important provision that will often waive a lot of rights and really shift around who's responsible for what. And that's a good, that's a good one. If you're seeing a lot of issues pop up in contracts with that and have questions, that's maybe a good thing to talk to an attorney about, to try to figure out, form language that you can push back with or something. Confidentiality as well. In the world we're living in today, there's a lot of talk about confidentiality and NDAs, and there's a lot of language that you'll probably be presented with as you're negotiating. And again, kind of in theme with everything else I've said, make sure it's reciprocal, right? If you're agreeing to keep their information they're giving you confidential, they should also be agreeing to keep whatever you're giving them confidential. And that's one that we see a lot, that it will be only one-sided. And it's really important, I think, to have your information protected as well. And the final one of contract review is looking at the warranty language. If you're receiving services, make sure you're looking at that warranty and being aware of what exactly your rights are after the agreement begins or after you receive the services. Making sure you're kind of keeping apprised of what your rights are, what your window to call out any issues is going to be important. And this I think whole slide is very helpful. I would, maybe you can print it out and make it a little checklist and kind of help, if you have internal contract reviewers or you have a project manager that handles this kind of work routinely. These are, I would say, pretty like agreement type neutral and often appear in most agreements. So hopefully that is a good kind of takeaway. I know the first few mistakes are a little bit more basic and you've probably heard before, but I thought that this would be a good way to really have a value add and make you guys, kind of think about something you see every day and hopefully give you some good points. So if you have any questions for me, I am happy to answer them.
Yes, so I will moderate the questions. Feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat or unmute yourself to share any additional context that you have with the questions as well. And just while we wait and give everyone a few minutes to ask any questions, I did want to let you know about our next All Up in Your Business small webinar. It's scheduled for Monday, October 21st at 11:30 a.m. It's with Business Development Specialist Jerry Townsend. He's with the Rivers East Workforce Development. He will cover work-based learning grants on incumbent workers, provide grant funding for internships, work experience programs, and on-the-job training information. Participants will also learn about Rivers East's availability to provide wage scenario analysis, strategic planning, recruitment, their ability to post job postings, and a lot of other things that regard to employment and business development across the small business sector. Registration is now open and will be sent out with the follow-up email after today's webinar.